In the Brown estate's dining room, a 74-year-old grandmother was about to shatter her family's assumptions. What started as Sunday dinner took a shocking turn when her son told her to act your age. Grace Brown wasn't your typical elderly matriarch. For 15 years, she had quietly built a financial empire, known for strategic intelligence hidden beneath gentle manners. When Marcus dismissed her business concerns, he had no idea he was triggering a revelation that would destroy his world. Grace's retreat to her husband's study would unleash the truth about who really held power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Brown family would never recover from learning their helpless grandmother owned everything. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the mahogany dining table, illuminating the careful arrangement Grace Brown had spent the better part of the afternoon perfecting. Each piece of china sat precisely where it belonged, the silverware aligned with military precision, and the centerpiece, white roses from her garden, provided the final touch to what had become her weekly ritual. At 74, Grace still insisted on preparing these Sunday dinners herself, despite Mrs. Hendrick's gentle protests about her arthritis. "The roast is perfect, Mom," Diane said, cutting into the tender beef with practiced politeness. Her voice carried the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to prevent conflict before it began. "You always outdid yourself." Grace smiled, the expression automatic after decades of hosting these gatherings. "Thank you, dear. I remember when your father used to say the same thing." She glanced toward the head of the table, where Thomas's empty chair remained, 15 years after his death. Some habits died harder than others. Marcus barely looked up from his plate, his attention divided between his meal and the phone that buzzed intermittently beside his water glass. At 52, he carried himself with the self-importance of a man who believed his presence alone elevated any gathering. His teenage daughter Tori sat beside him, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the family dynamics with the unforgiving clarity that only 17-year-olds possessed. "Actually," Marcus said, finally setting down his fork with the deliberate gesture of someone preparing to make an announcement. "I'm glad everyone's here. I've got some exciting news about the business." The word business hung in the air like a challenge. Grace's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her wineglass, but she said nothing. She had learned, over the years, that her silence often revealed more than her words ever could. "I've been talking to some investors," Marcus continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Real visionaries. They're putting together a tech startup focused on sustainable energy solutions. And they want experienced partners. The kind of opportunity that could set us up for the next generation." Robert Chen, Diane's husband, raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ambitious. What kind of capital investment are we talking about?" Marcus's smile widened. "That's the beauty of it. We've got assets just sitting there, generating steady but unspectacular returns. The Millbrook Inn and the Seaside Boutique Hotel specifically. Both properties are prime for liquidation." The room fell silent. Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprise, but a crystalline clarity that had been building for months. Years, perhaps. "You want to sell the hotels?" Jaime spoke for the first time since Grace had been said. Her youngest son's voice carried the careful modulation of someone who had learned, through hard experience, to choose his words carefully. "Not sell," Marcus corrected. "Leverage. Transform debt equity into dynamic opportunity. The hospitality industry is stagnant, especially in these smaller coastal markets. We could triple our returns within 18 months. Grace set down her wineglass with deliberate precision. "Those hotels have been profitable for 23 consecutive years. Even during the recession, they maintained positive cash flow." "Sure, if you call 3 to 5% returns profitable," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he was explaining basic mathematics to a child. "But we're talking about 10 to 15% potential here, maybe more." "During peak season?" Grace asked quietly. "You want to sell during our busiest quarter?" Marcus's expression shifted, revealing the first hints of impatience. "Mom, I appreciate your interest, but these are complex financial decisions. The market timing is perfect right now. Waiting another year could cost us significantly. I understand market timing, Grace said, her voice remaining steady despite the heat building in her chest. What I don't understand is disposing of proven assets for speculative investments. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was the kind of silence that preceded either reconciliation or war. Look, Marcus said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that Grace had come to recognize as his default when challenged. I know you want to be involved, but this isn't about managing the household budget or planning dinner parties. This is about real money. Serious money. Diane shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Marcus, maybe we should… No. It's fine, Marcus interrupted, his attention fixed on his mother. Mom, I need you to understand something. Dad's been gone for 15 years. The world has changed. The business world has changed. You need to act your age and leave the business to people who understand it. The words hit Grace like a physical blow, not because they were particularly cruel. She had heard worse over the years, but because they crystallized something she had been feeling for too long. The dismissal, the assumption that her age made her irrelevant, the casual erasure of her intelligence, her experience, her contributions. Act my age, she repeated quietly. That's not what I meant, Marcus said, though his tone suggested it was exactly what he meant. I just think… No. Grace's voice cut through his explanation with surgical precision. I understand exactly what you meant. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Every eye at the table tracked her motion, but she looked at no one. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on dessert. Mom, we're not finished discussing, Marcus began. Yes, Grace said, her hand already on the dining room door. We are. The hallway felt cooler than the dining room, though Grace wasn't sure if that was real or imagined. Her feet carried her automatically toward the kitchen, then past it, toward the back of the house where Thomas's study waited. Their study, she corrected herself. It had always been theirs, even when he was alive. Especially when he was alive. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Grace allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. The room smelled of leather and old wood, of the pipe tobacco Thomas had favored, and the particular mustiness that came with books that had been read and reread over decades. His desk still held his fountain pen, though the ink had long since dried. His reading glasses lay folded beside the lamp, as if he had just stepped out for a moment. But it was the portrait above the fireplace that drew her attention, not the formal family photo that everyone expected, but the candid shot Mrs. Hendricks had taken during one of their business meetings. Thomas at his desk, Grace beside him, both of them leaning over spreadsheets and contracts with the focused intensity of true partners. Act my age, she said to the empty room, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved to the bookshelf, her fingers finding the familiar spine of Thomas's copy of The Art of War. The book slid forward, revealing the digital lock that Mrs. Hendricks had installed 3 years ago. Grace's fingers moved automatically across the numbers. Thomas's birthday, her birthday, the date they had first met. The lock clicked open. The hidden safe behind the bookshelf contained the fruits of 15 years of careful planning. Deeds, stock certificates, bank statements, legal documents that painted a picture very different from the one her family had constructed in their minds. Grace pulled out the first folder, her hands steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to confront. The Millbrook Inn deed, stamped and notarized, with her name as the sole owner. The Seaside Boutique Hotel, likewise. The Brown family estate, purchased outright in 1987 and transferred to her name upon Thomas's death. But those were just the beginning. The real revelation lay in the subsequent acquisitions. The properties in Martha's Vineyard, the commercial real estate in Hartford, the diversified portfolio that had grown quietly and steadily while everyone assumed she was simply managing household accounts. 87%. That was the number Mrs. Hendricks had calculated last month during their quarterly review. Grace Brown owned 87% of what the family considered their assets. Everything they took for granted. The house they lived in, the businesses that funded their comfortable lives, the safety net that allowed Marcus to take his risks and Jaime to pursue his art. All of it rested on foundations Grace had built while remaining invisible. She heard Thomas's voice in her memory from one of their last conversations before his final illness. "They're going to test you, Grace. They'll assume that because you're quiet, you're weak. Because you're kind, you're foolish. Because you're a woman, you're less than. Don't let them." "I let them," she whispered to the portrait. "For 15 years I let them." But as she sat in the leather chair that had been Thomas's favorite, surrounded by the evidence of her true power, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, though that was certainly present. Not hurt, though that cut deep. What she felt was clarity. Marcus wanted to act like the head of the family? Like the one who made the real decisions? Like the one who understood money and business and the serious matters of the world? Grace Brown was about to give him exactly what he wanted. She was going to act her age. And at 74, she was old enough to have learned that the most dangerous opponents were the ones nobody saw coming. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup the following morning, though he would have denied it if anyone had noticed. The previous evening's dinner had ended in uncomfortable silence after Grace's abrupt departure, with family members drifting away like smoke dissipating in still air. He'd stayed up until nearly 2 a.m., scrolling through investment portfolios and market projections, trying to convince himself that his mother's concerns were simply the anxious worries of someone who didn't understand modern finance. But something in her voice, that quiet, measured tone when she'd repeated his words back to him, had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. Meanwhile, in the estate's sunroom, Grace Brown sat across from Mrs. Hendricks at a small wrought iron table, steam rising from their matching china cups as the morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows. To any casual observer, they appeared to be two elderly women sharing their daily ritual of coffee and gossip. The reality was far more complex. "He wants to sell the Millbrook Inn in the seaside," Grace said without preamble, her voice carrying none of the hurt from the previous evening. In its place was something harder, more calculating. "Marcus has found himself some tech investors." Mrs. Hendricks, Eleanor to her friends, though Grace was perhaps the only person left who remembered her first name, set down her cup with deliberate precision. At 68, she possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that people often mistook for mere efficiency. Her steel gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing. "The hotels that have been profitable for 23 consecutive years?" she asked, though they both knew she was intimately familiar with every property in Grace's portfolio. "The ones currently booked solid through October?" "The very same." Grace opened the leather portfolio she'd brought from Thomas's study, revealing a collection of documents that would have shocked her family into silence. "Perhaps it's time we reviewed our complete position." Mrs. Hendricks reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a pair of reading glasses, settling them on her nose with the air of someone preparing for serious business. Which, in fact, she was. "Shall we start with the hotels?" she asked, producing her own folder, a much thicker one that she kept locked in her quarters upstairs. "Let's start with everything." For the next hour, the two women conducted what Grace had come to think of as their strategic assessment, a quarterly review that no one else in the family knew existed. The numbers, laid out in Mrs. Hendricks' meticulous handwriting and supported by official documents, painted a picture that would have stunned the Brown family into speechlessness. Grace Brown didn't just own the Millbrook Inn and the Seaside Boutique Hotel. She owned them outright, free and clear, along with the Brown family estate and its 43 acres of Connecticut coastline. She owned the small shopping complex in downtown Millbrook that housed Diane's art gallery. She owned residential properties in 3 states, commercial real estate in Hartford and Boston, and a diversified investment portfolio that had grown steadily for over a decade. 87%, Mrs. Hendricks said, running her finger down a column of figures. "As of last quarter's assessment, you control 87% of what the family considers, quote, Brown family assets." Grace sipped her coffee, letting the numbers settle in her mind. It wasn't that she'd forgotten. She reviewed these figures regularly, but hearing it stated so baldly always carried a certain satisfaction. "Tell me about Marcus," she said. Mrs. Hendricks flipped to a different section of her folder. Her information-gathering abilities would have impressed intelligence agencies. Living in the house, moving through the family's daily life with the invisibility that domestic staff often enjoyed, she saw and heard everything. His divorce settlement was more expensive than he's admitted, she began. The alimony payments alone are eating up 40% of his salary. Add in private school tuition for both children, the lease on that ridiculous car, and his Manhattan apartment that he's keeping, quote, just in case. He's leveraged to the breaking point. Hence the enthusiasm for high-return investments. Desperation makes people reckless, Mrs. Hendricks observed. But there's more. He's been telling people, friends, colleagues, his ex-wife's lawyer, that he's the, quote, de facto head of the Brown family business. He's been implying that his inheritance is already settled. Grace felt a familiar spark of something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't far from it. Has he now? He's also been suggesting that you're not entirely competent to manage complex financial matters. Age-related cognitive decline, he calls it. Very sad, very concerning for the family. The coffee cup in Grace's hand remained perfectly steady, but Mrs. Hendricks, who had known her for 30 years, recognized the telltale sign of Grace Brown's true anger. Absolute stillness. And Diane? Struggling more than she's let on. The gallery has been bleeding money for 2 years. She's been working 3 part-time jobs to keep it afloat, bookkeeping for 2 other businesses, and teaching art classes at the community college. She thinks nobody knows. But I've been covering her shortfalls. The mysterious cash deposits that appear in her business account every month? Yes. She's never asked where they come from, but I think she's starting to suspect. Mrs. Hendricks turned another page. Robert knows, of course. He's the one who recommended the accountant who processes the transfers. Grace nodded. Robert Chen had been her unofficial financial advisor for years, one of the few people who had treated her as an equal partner rather than a grieving widow in need of protection. His architectural practice had taught him to think in terms of solid foundations and long-term planning, qualities that had served Grace well in building her empire. Jaime? Clean for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. He keeps track. Mrs. Hendricks' voice softened slightly. He's been painting again. Real painting, not just the therapy exercises. There's talent there, Grace. Real talent. His father always said he had the artist's eye. The boy spends more time with you than any of the others. He sees things. He's starting to ask questions about your errands and meetings. Grace considered this. Of all her children, Jaime had always been the most perceptive, the most emotionally intelligent. His addiction had been, in many ways, an attempt to dull that sensitivity, rather than learn to manage it. His sobriety had brought back the clarity that made him dangerous to people with secrets. And Tori? Mrs. Hendricks smiled. The first genuine smile of their conversation. That girl is something special. She's been researching the family business online, trying to understand the structure. She's also been asking very pointed questions about college funding. She's worried about affording school. She's worried about being dependent on her father's promises. Smart girl. She's already figured out that Marcus's grand investment schemes might not be as solid as he claims. Grace closed her portfolio and leaned back in her chair, watching the morning light play across the manicured gardens that stretched toward the sound. Somewhere in the main house, her family was beginning their day, unaware that their assumptions about power and money and authority were built on foundations of sand. 15 years, she said quietly. Mrs. Hendricks knew exactly what she meant. 15 years since Thomas's death, when Grace had made the decision that would define the rest of her life. 15 years of careful planning, strategic acquisitions, and deliberate invisibility. The memory came clearly. Grace, in this very room, 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral, surrounded by lawyers and financial advisors who spoke to her in the gentle, patronizing tones reserved for grieving widows. Don't worry about the business details, Mrs. Brown. We'll handle everything, you just focus on healing. She had nodded and smiled and played the part they expected. Then she had quietly fired half of them and begun building something they never could have imagined. I used their assumptions against them, Grace said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Every time someone dismissed me as just a widow, Every time they assumed I was too grief-stricken, or too old or too female to understand, quote, real business, I gained an advantage. You became invisible, Mrs. Hendricks agreed, and invisible people can accomplish remarkable things. Grace reached for the portfolio again, her fingers tracing the leather binding. Thomas always said the best strategies were the ones your opponents never saw coming. What did he say about family? Grace was quiet for a long moment, remembering her husband's voice, his last coherent conversation before the cancer took his clarity. He said they would test me, that they would assume my kindness was weakness, my quiet nature was ignorance. He said I shouldn't let them. And have you? For 15 years, yes, I let Marcus believe he was the natural heir. I let Diane struggle rather than openly helping her. I let them all think I was just grandmother, just the woman who cooked Sunday dinner and remembered birthdays. Mrs. Hendricks leaned forward slightly. And now? Grace stood, gathering her documents with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Now Marcus wants me to act my age. He wants me to leave business to people who understand it. So you're going to act your age. I'm 74 years old, Eleanor. I'm old enough to have learned patience. Old enough to have learned strategy. Old enough to have learned that the most powerful position is the one nobody sees. She walked to the window, looking out at the estate that was hers. Every acre, every building, every carefully maintained garden. I'm old enough to stop pretending to be powerless. Mrs. Hendricks began gathering her own papers, her movements efficient and practiced. What's the first move? Grace turned back to her oldest friend and most trusted ally, her face wearing an expression that Mrs. Hendricks recognized from the old days, when Grace and Thomas had been partners in every sense of the word. Call Jonathan at the law firm. Tell him I need to schedule a family meeting. Formal setting, all the proper documentation. Grace's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. It's time the Brown family learned exactly who owns what. All of it? We'll start with the hotels Marcus wants to sell. Let them process that reality first. Grace moved toward the door, then paused. And Eleanor? Make sure the meeting is in the library. Thomas always said that important conversations should happen in rooms with good foundations. As Grace left the sunroom, Mrs. Hendricks remained at the table for a moment, watching her employer, her friend, walk away with the measured stride of someone who had just made a decision that would change everything. She reached for her phone to call the law firm, already composing the conversation in her mind. After 30 years of watching Grace Brown be dismissed, underestimated, and patronized by people who should have known better, Mrs. Hendricks was looking forward to what came next. The Brown family was about to learn that their gentle, aging matriarch had been playing a very different game than they imagined, and she had been winning for 15 years. The library had always been the most formal room in the Brown estate, with its floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, Persian rugs, and the massive oak table that Thomas had imported from England 30 years ago. Grace had chosen it deliberately for this morning's family meeting, understanding that setting mattered as much as substance when delivering news that would fundamentally alter people's understanding of reality. She arrived 20 minutes early, placing manila folders at each seat with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that preparation was the difference between victory and defeat. Mrs. Hendricks had arranged the documents the night before, each folder containing exactly what its recipient needed to see, no more, no less. Jonathan Brewster, the family's attorney, sat quietly in the corner, his own briefcase filled with legal documentation that would serve as unassailable proof of what Grace was about to reveal. Marcus entered first, as Grace had known he would. At 52, he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged, his expensive suit and precisely styled hair projecting an image of control that Grace was about to systematically dismantle. He glanced at the folders with mild curiosity, the kind of dismissive attention one might give to a child's art project. "Mom, I hope this isn't going to take long," he said, checking his Rolex with theatrical impatience. "I've got a conference call with the investors at 11. They're eager to move forward on the hotel liquidation." Grace smiled, the expression warm and grandmotherly, giving no hint of the cold satisfaction building in her chest. Of course, dear. I wouldn't want to keep you from your important business. Diane arrived next, her anxiety evident in the way she twisted her wedding ring, a tell Grace had observed for 20 years. At 49, Diane had perfected the art of diplomatic invisibility, always trying to smooth over family conflicts before they could escalate. She took her seat across from Marcus, her eyes darting between her mother and brother as if calculating the potential for disaster. Jaime entered quietly, as was his way, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world without causing unnecessary disturbance. His 3 years of sobriety had brought back a clarity that Grace remembered from his childhood, when he had been the family member most likely to notice what others missed. He nodded respectfully to Jonathan, recognizing the significance of legal counsel being present. Robert Chen arrived with Diane, his architect's eye automatically assessing the room's proportions and sightlines. He had always been Grace's favorite in-law, treating her with the genuine respect that seemed to elude her own children. His presence provided a stabilizing influence that Grace appreciated, especially given what she was about to unleash. Tori was the last to arrive, her 17-year-old frame radiating the kind of barely contained energy that came with intelligence, forced to operate within adult constraints. She had been surprised by the invitation to what was obviously a serious family discussion, but her sharp eyes had already catalogued the formal setting, the lawyer's presence, and the careful way her grandmother had arranged the meeting. "Thank you all for coming," Grace began, her voice carrying the measured authority she had learned from watching Thomas conduct business meetings in this very room. "I called this meeting to discuss Marcus's proposal regarding the Millbrook Inn and the Seaside Boutique Hotel." Marcus leaned forward, his confidence evident. "I'm glad you're finally ready to listen to reason, Mom. These investors represent exactly the kind of forward-thinking partnership that could transform our family's financial position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "I'm sure they do," Grace replied, her tone remaining pleasant. "However, before we discuss any potential sale, I thought it might be helpful for everyone to understand exactly what we're talking about." She gestured to the folders. "Please, open them." The sound of rustling paper filled the room as 5 family members opened their folders simultaneously. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the antique clock on the mantelpiece marking the seconds with mechanical precision. Marcus stared at the document in his hands, a property deed bearing the official seals and stamps that made it legally unassailable. His name appeared nowhere on the document. Instead, in clear, legally verified text, it showed sole ownership of the Millbrook Inn transferred to Grace Brown upon the death of her husband, Thomas Brown, 15 years prior. "This has to be wrong," he said, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty Grace had heard from him in years. "There's been some mistake." "I'm afraid not," Jonathan Brewster spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the professional authority of someone who had been practicing law for 40 years. "Those documents are certified copies of the original deeds, filed with the county and state. They're a matter of public record." Diane's folder contained similar documentation for the Seaside Boutique Hotel, along with a detailed financial statement showing 15 years of carefully managed profits and improvements. Her face had gone pale as she processed the implications. "Mom?" she said quietly, "you own both hotels?" "I do," Grace confirmed, her voice betraying none of the satisfaction she felt at their shocked expressions. "I have owned them, free and clear, since your father's death. Just as I own this house, and the 43 acres it sits on." Tori's folder contained a different kind of revelation, a comprehensive breakdown of the Brown family business empire that showed holdings far beyond what any of them had imagined. Her grandmother, the woman they had all assumed was living comfortably on widow's benefits and family generosity, controlled a portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. "Jesus Christ," Jaime breathed, then immediately colored with embarrassment. "Sorry, Mom, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Grace said, her tone gentle but carrying an edge that made Marcus shift uncomfortably in his chair. "That was rather the point. Marcus was rallying now, his initial shock giving way to the kind of aggressive denial that had served him well in his investment banking career. Even if this is all legitimate, and I'm not saying it is, there are questions about competency, about whether these decisions were made under duress or influence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jonathan Brewster straightened in his chair, his professional instincts recognizing the danger inherent in what Marcus had just suggested. "Are you questioning my mental competency?" Grace asked, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone while her eyes grew arctic. "I'm saying that someone clearly took advantage of your grief after Dad's death," Marcus replied, his voice gaining strength as he convinced himself of his own narrative. "These documents could have been signed under emotional distress without proper legal counsel, Mr. Brewster," Grace said, turning to the attorney. "Would you please explain to my son the legal requirements for the transfers he's questioning?" Jonathan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. The transfers in question were executed over a period of several years, with multiple witnesses, psychological evaluations confirming competency, and full legal review. Mrs. Brown was represented by independent counsel throughout the process, specifically to prevent any future challenges based on undue influence or diminished capacity. Grace opened her own folder, revealing documents that made Marcus's face drain of color. "I was quite thorough, dear. Your father taught me the importance of proper documentation." The room fell silent again as the full implications settled over the family. Marcus had built his entire identity around being the presumptive heir to the Brown family business empire. Diane had spent 2 years struggling to keep her gallery afloat while assuming family wealth was out of reach. Jaime had accepted his position as the family disappointment, never imagining that his mother commanded resources that could have easily supported his artistic pursuits. "Why?" Diane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why keep this secret?" Grace considered the question carefully. It deserved an honest answer, even if honesty would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. "Because I wanted to see who you really were," she said finally. "When people believe you have no power, they show you their true nature. When they think you're just a harmless old woman managing household accounts, they stop performing for you." Her eyes moved around the table, meeting each family member's gaze in turn. "I learned things about each of you that I never would have discovered if you had known the truth." Marcus's face was red now, his composure cracking under the weight of his collapsing assumptions. "So this has all been some kind of test? Some elaborate manipulation?" "Call it what you like," Grace replied. "But before you become too indignant, ask yourself this. What would you have done differently if you had known? Would you have treated me with more respect? Been more considerate of my opinions? Or would you simply have been more careful about how you dismissed them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge none of them seemed ready to answer. Tori spoke into the silence, her teenage bluntness cutting through the adult complexity. "You would have been fake nice instead of real dismissive. That's what she means." Grace smiled at her granddaughter, the first genuine smile of the meeting. "Exactly." Robert Chen, who had been quietly reviewing the documents in his folder, looked up with something that might have been admiration. "The property acquisitions," he said. "The timing, the locations. This wasn't random, was it?" "Your architectural background serves you well," Grace acknowledged. "Each acquisition was strategic. The shopping complex that houses Diane's gallery, for instance. I purchased it 3 years ago, then arranged for the mysterious benefactor who has been keeping her rent artificially low." Diane's hand flew to her mouth. "That was you?" "I've been supporting all of you, in various ways, for years," Grace continued. "Marcus, who do you think has been covering the shortfall between your salary and your actual expenses? Your lifestyle costs approximately 40% more than you earn." Marcus started to protest, but Grace held up her hand. "The private school tuition that you assumed your ex-wife was handling? I've been paying it directly to the schools. The lease on your Manhattan apartment? My accountant processes those payments. The emergency fund that mysteriously appeared in your account after the divorce settlement? That was me." Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Marcus, who had spent 15 years believing himself to be the family's financial backbone, was discovering that he had been completely dependent on the woman he had been dismissing as irrelevant. "Jaime," Grace continued, your art supplies, the rent on your studio space, the health insurance that kept you covered during recovery, all of it traced back to accounts I control. Jaime's eyes filled with tears. I thought I was finally managing on my own. You were managing your sobriety on your own, Grace said gently. That was the only part that mattered. The rest was just logistics. She stood, moving to the window that looked out over the estate grounds. What I learned, watching all of you these past years, is that most people are quite comfortable taking things for granted when they believe they come from someone powerless to withdraw them. Marcus found his voice again, though it was strained. So what now? You've humiliated us all, proven your point. What exactly do you want? Grace turned back to face the room, her expression unreadable. What I want, Marcus, is what I've always wanted. Respect, consideration, to be treated as an intelligent adult rather than a sentimental relic. And if we refuse? The question came out harsher than Marcus had probably intended, but Grace heard the real threat underneath. She had expected this moment, the attempt to call her bluff, to force her hand. Then you'll discover what financial independence actually looks like, she replied calmly. The hotels stay under my control. The estate remains my property. The various supports and subsidies end immediately. You become the self-reliant adults you've been pretending to be all along. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocks. This was the silence of people realizing that their world had fundamentally changed, and they were going to have to decide how to respond. This is just the beginning, Grace said, moving back to her chair. We have much more to discuss about the family's actual financial situation and everyone's role in it going forward. She sat down with the satisfied air of someone who had just completed the first phase of a carefully planned campaign. The Brown family meeting was far from over, but the power dynamics that had defined them for 15 years had just been permanently altered. Marcus stared at the documents in front of him, his investment banker's mind finally beginning to grasp the scope of what his mother had built while he wasn't paying attention. The woman he had dismissed as out of touch with modern business had been playing a game so sophisticated that he was only now beginning to understand the rules. In the corner, Jonathan Brewster made notes in his legal pad, already anticipating the conversations that would follow this meeting. 30 years of estate law had taught him to recognize pivotal moments, and what he had just witnessed would reshape the Brown family for generations to come. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11 o'clock. Marcus's conference call with his investors would have to wait. The hotel liquidation he had been so confident about was no longer his decision to make. Grace Brown had acted her age. And at 74, she was old enough to know exactly how much power she had been hiding. The family meeting had ended in a silence so profound that even the grandfather clock seemed to tick more quietly. Marcus had been the first to leave, clutching the documents that destroyed his understanding of his place in the world, his confident stride replaced by the uncertain gait of someone walking on ground that had suddenly proven unreliable. The others had followed in stages, Diane with her hand pressed to her mouth as if physically holding back questions, Jaime with the careful movements of someone afraid to disturb the air around him, and Tori with the sharp-eyed attention of someone cataloging every detail for future analysis. 3 days later, the reverberations of Grace's revelations continued to reshape the Brown family landscape in ways both subtle and seismic. Marcus sat in his Millbrook office, a space he rented monthly but had always described as the family's business headquarters, staring at his laptop screen with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for life-or-death situations. Which, from his perspective, this was. His investment banker's training had taught him to verify information, to look for discrepancies that might provide leverage, to find the weakness in any seemingly solid position. What he had found after 72 hours of frantic research was that his mother's documentation was not just legitimate, it was impeccable. Every deed, every transfer, every acquisition had been handled with the kind of legal precision that made challenges virtually impossible. Worse, from Marcus's perspective, was the timeline the documents revealed. Grace hadn't inherited this empire and then hidden it. She had built it, piece by piece, acquisition by acquisition, while everyone assumed she was simply managing household accounts and grieving her husband's death. His phone buzzed with a text from the tech investors. Looking forward to finalizing hotel purchase agreements this week? Timeline still viable? Marcus stared at the message, his throat tight. The hotels he had promised to deliver weren't his to sell, had never been his to sell. The investment opportunity that was supposed to solve his financial problems, the alimony payments, the private school tuition, the Manhattan apartment lease that was bleeding him dry, had evaporated the moment his mother opened those manila folders. He scrolled through his contacts until he found his lawyer's number. If Grace thought she could simply humiliate him in front of the family and walk away, she had underestimated the kind of resources he could bring to bear. There had to be something, some procedural error, some question of undue influence, some legal avenue that could restore the natural order of things. Meanwhile, across town, Diane Brown Chen stood in her art gallery, surrounded by the carefully curated collection that represented 2 years of struggle and compromise. The space was beautiful. High ceilings, perfect lighting, hardwood floors that had been restored to their original luster, but it had also been slowly bankrupting her. Or so she had thought. The envelope that had arrived that morning contained bank statements going back 3 years, showing deposits that appeared in her business account with clockwork regularity. Always the exact amount needed to cover her shortfall. Always timed perfectly to prevent overdrafts or missed payments. Always from an account labeled Millbrook Holdings, LLC, her mother's holding company. Robert found her there at noon, sitting on the gallery floor with bank statements scattered around her like fallen leaves. Her husband had seen that particular expression before, the look of someone reassembling their understanding of reality one piece at a time. "How long have you known?" she asked without looking up. Robert settled onto the floor beside his wife, his architect's training making him automatically assess the structural integrity of the old building around them. "About your mother's financial situation? 3 years. About her covering your gallery expenses?" "I suspected, but she asked me not to confirm it." Diane finally met his eyes. "You've been lying to me for 3 years." "I've been respecting your mother's wishes for 3 years," he corrected gently. "She wanted you to believe you were succeeding on your own merit." "But I wasn't. Weren't you?" Robert gestured around the gallery, at the paintings that lined the walls and the sculpture pieces that caught the afternoon light. "Did Grace Brown choose these artists? Did she arrange the exhibitions, write the reviews, build the relationships with collectors? Did she create the vision that makes this space special?" Diane was quiet for a long moment, processing the distinction he was drawing. "She just kept me from failing. She gave you the financial security to take risks, to choose artists based on talent rather than commercial viability, to build something meaningful rather than something safe." Robert reached for her hand. "Your mother didn't create your success, Diane. She just made sure your talent had room to flourish." The observation should have been comforting, but Diane found herself grappling with a more complex emotion. Gratitude mixed with shame, relief tangled with resentment. For 2 years, she had been proud of her independence, her ability to keep the gallery afloat through sheer determination and multiple jobs. Now she was discovering that her independence had been an illusion, carefully maintained by the woman she had been unconsciously dismissing as out of touch with modern realities. Her phone rang, Marcus's name appearing on the screen. Diane considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in her brother's behavior over the past 3 days suggested this conversation was inevitable. "Diane, we need to talk." Marcus's voice was tight with controlled urgency. "About Mom's situation." "What situation would that be, Marcus?" "Don't be naive. You can't possibly believe that all of this is legitimate. Someone has been taking advantage of her grief, her age. These property transfers, the hidden accounts. None of it makes sense unless you consider that she's been manipulated." Diane closed her eyes, recognizing her brother's voice, the tone he used when he was trying to convince investors to ignore warning signs. "Marcus, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we have a responsibility to protect our mother from people who would exploit her emotional vulnerability. And I'm suggesting that means challenging these questionable financial arrangements before they do permanent damage to the family. You want to sue Mom, quote dot. I want to protect the family's assets from predatory advisors who have clearly been taking advantage of an elderly widow. The words hung in the air, and Diane felt something crystallize in her mind. Her brother wasn't concerned about their mother's well-being. He was concerned about his own financial expectations being threatened. The investment opportunity he had been so excited about, the lifestyle he had built on assumptions about his inheritance, all of it depended on Grace being the powerless figure he had always believed her to be. No, Diane said quietly. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, Marcus. I won't help you challenge Mom's ownership of property that legally belongs to her. I won't pretend that she's been manipulated when the evidence suggests she's been more strategic than any of us realized. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Then, you're making a mistake, Diane. When this all falls apart, don't expect the family to bail you out. The line went dead, and Diane found herself staring at her phone with a mixture of sadness and clarity. Her brother was preparing for war against their mother, and he had just made it clear that anyone who didn't join him would be considered an enemy. Meanwhile, in the converted carriage house behind the main estate, Jaime Brown was experiencing his own reckoning with revised reality. The space had been his sanctuary for 3 years, a place where he could paint without judgment, work through his recovery without constant family scrutiny, and slowly rebuild the artistic vision that addiction had nearly destroyed. What he hadn't known was that his mother had been quietly funding not just his rent, but his art supplies, his health insurance, and the small stipend that had allowed him to focus on recovery rather than survival. The easel in front of him held a half-finished painting, a seascape that captured the view from his studio window with the kind of precise observation that had always been his strength. But his hands were shaking too badly to hold a brush steady, and it wasn't withdrawal symptoms causing the tremor. It was shame. For 3 years he had been proud of his sobriety, his growing artistic output, his ability to maintain stability without the family drama that had characterized his 20s and 30s. He had thought he was finally becoming the man his father would have been proud of, the son who could stand on his own feet and contribute something meaningful to the world. Now he was discovering that his independence had been as carefully constructed as a stage set, maintained by someone who had never once made him feel like a burden or a charity case. The studio door opened without a knock, a liberty only one person in the family ever took. Grace entered carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the kind of practical clothes that suggested she had been working in her garden. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, settling into the old armchair that she had moved into the studio during his first month of sobriety. "How are you feeling?" It was the same question she had asked every day for 3 years, delivered in the same gentle tone that never suggested judgment or expectation. Today, though, Jaime heard it differently. "How long have you been taking care of me?" he asked. Grace poured coffee into 2 mugs, the domestic ritual giving her time to consider her answer. "I've been supporting you since you decided to get clean. Before that, I was just enabling you." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She handed him a mug, their fingers touching briefly. "Your father used to say that the hardest part of loving someone was knowing when to help and when to let them struggle. When you were using, helping you meant making your consequences easier to avoid. When you got sober, helping you meant making sure you had the security to focus on recovery." Jaime turned to look at the paintings that lined his studio walls, 3 years of work that represented the slow return of his artistic vision. But it was all fake. My independence, my success. Was it? Grace moved to stand beside him, studying the seascape on his easel. "Did I mix these colors for you? Did I choose the composition, guide your brush, decide what story you wanted to tell? No, but then how exactly was it fake?" Her voice carried the patient authority of someone who had spent decades thinking about the difference between support and control. "Jaime, I made sure you had a roof over your head and food in your refrigerator and access to health care. You made sure you stayed sober, developed your talent, and built something meaningful with your life." She gestured toward the paintings around them. "This work, this growth, that's all you. I just made sure you had the space to accomplish it." Jaime was quiet for a long moment, studying his mother's face in the afternoon light that filtered through his studio windows. Marcus is angry. Marcus is scared, Grace corrected. He built his identity around assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. That's frightening for anyone. He's talking about challenging your ownership of the hotels. Grace nodded, unsurprised. I expected that. Your brother has always believed that the loudest voice in the room must be the most important one. And if he tries, then he'll learn another lesson about the difference between making noise and having power. Grace moved toward the door, then paused. Jaime, I need you to understand something. Everything I've done, the secrecy, the support, the strategic planning, all of it was about protecting this family while teaching them to respect it. That includes protecting them from their own worst impulses. After she left, Jaime stood in his studio surrounded by 3 years of artistic recovery, trying to reconcile his shame with his mother's words. The paintings on his walls represented thousands of hours of work, of struggle, of slowly rebuilding skills that addiction had nearly destroyed. Grace hadn't painted them. She had simply made sure he had the stability to do the work himself. For the first time since the family meeting, Jaime found himself able to pick up a brush without his hands shaking. Across the estate, in the main house, Mrs. Hendricks was preparing dinner with the kind of methodical precision that had characterized her 30 years of service to the Brown family. But tonight's meal would be different. Tonight, Grace had requested that they use the good china, the Limoges set that usually only appeared for holidays, and set the table for 6 instead of the usual 5. Marcus wouldn't be joining them for dinner. He had made his choice clear in a voicemail that morning, informing his mother that he would be unavailable for family gatherings until the irregularities in the estate planning were resolved. Grace had listened to the message twice, then deleted it with the kind of calm finality that Mrs. Hendricks recognized as dangerous. 30 years of friendship had taught her to read Grace Brown's moods like weather patterns, and what she saw now was the steady approach of a perfect storm. The Brown family was fracturing along predictable lines, those who could accept a new understanding of power, and those who could not. What happened next would determine not just the family's financial future, but whether it would remain a family at all. In her quarters above the kitchen, Mrs. Hendricks made her own phone call to Jonathan Brewster's office. If Marcus was preparing for legal warfare, Grace would need to be ready, and Mrs. Hendricks intended to make sure her oldest friend had every advantage when the battle began. The matriarch's reckoning was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The autumn light filtering through the estate's tall windows had taken on the golden quality that Grace had always loved about October afternoons. It was the kind of light that made everything seem more substantial, more permanent, which struck her as ironic given how thoroughly she was dismantling her family's assumptions about permanence. 5 days had passed since the library meeting, and Grace had spent them conducting what she privately thought of as her individual assessments, one-on-one conversations that would determine which relationships could survive the truth and which were too fragile to bear the weight of honesty. Her first conversation was with Diane, who arrived at the main house precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying herself with the nervous energy of someone who had spent sleepless nights reorganizing their understanding of reality. Grace received her in the morning room, a space that had always been more comfortable than formal, overstuffed chairs arranged around a fireplace, family photographs covering every available surface, the kind of room where difficult conversations felt possible. "Thank you for coming," Grace said, gesturing toward the chair across from her own. "I imagine you have questions." Diane settled into the chair with visible tension, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't even know where to begin, Mom. The gallery? The mysterious deposits, the fact that you've been—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "Supporting you without your knowledge," Grace finished gently. "Yes, I imagine that's complicated to process." "I've been so proud," Diane's voice cracked slightly. "For 2 years I thought I was finally proving myself, keeping the gallery afloat through my own hard work. I took 3 part-time jobs. I haven't bought new clothes in 18 months. I've been surviving on coffee and determination, telling myself that independence was worth any sacrifice." Grace leaned forward, her expression combining compassion with something that might have been regret. "And now you feel that pride was misplaced." wasn't it? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Grace took her time considering the answer. This conversation would set the tone for everything that followed, not just with Diane, but with the entire family's ability to move forward. "Tell me about the Morrison exhibition," Grace said finally. Diane blinked at the apparent change of subject. "What about it?" "You took a chance on an unknown artist. Invested 3 months of planning and most of your marketing budget on someone whose work had never been shown professionally. Everyone thought you were making a mistake." "The exhibition sold out," Diane said slowly. "Morrison's career took off from there. He's represented by galleries in Boston and New York now. Did I choose Morrison's work for you? No, but did I arrange the exhibition, write the catalog essay, convince the critics to attend the opening? No, Mom, but you were covering my expenses. Without that support, you might have made different choices," Grace interrupted. "Safer choices. You might have focused on commercially viable artists rather than following your instincts about talent. You might have built a successful business that had no soul." Diane was quiet for a long moment, processing the distinction her mother was drawing. "You're saying the money was just infrastructure?" "I'm saying that talent without security is often forced to compromise itself. I gave you the freedom to take risks, to choose quality over commercial safety, to build something meaningful rather than something merely profitable." Grace reached across the space between their chairs and touched her daughter's hand. "The success of your gallery, the reputation you've built, the artists you've championed, the respect you've earned in the art community, none of that came from my bank account. But I wouldn't have been able to do any of it without your support." "Perhaps not. But you also wouldn't have needed to if you had known about the family's actual financial resources from the beginning. I could have simply funded your gallery outright, made you an employee of the family business rather than an independent entrepreneur." Grace's smile held a hint of challenge. "Would you have preferred that?" The question forced Diane to confront something she hadn't fully articulated to herself. The struggle of the past 2 years, the sleepless nights and financial anxiety, had also been a period of tremendous growth. She had developed instincts about art and business that she never would have acquired if success had come easily. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I am," Grace said firmly. "You needed to prove to yourself that you could succeed. You needed to know that your judgment was sound, that your vision was valuable, that you could build something worthwhile through your own effort. If I had simply handed you financial security, you would have spent the rest of your life wondering whether your success was real." Diane felt tears welling up, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of gratitude and recognition. "You've been protecting my pride as much as supporting my business." "I've been protecting your growth," Grace corrected. "Pride can be false, but growth is always real." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the afternoon light shift across the room's oriental rugs. Finally, Diane spoke again. "Marcus called yesterday. He wants me to support him in challenging your ownership of the family assets." Grace's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested she had been expecting this. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him no." "But Mom—" Diane hesitated, then pushed forward. "He's not going to let this go. He's talking about undue influence, about questionable mental competency. He's planning to fight you." "I know," Grace said simply. "Your brother has never learned the difference between having power and needing to use it. He assumes that because I've revealed my position, I must be vulnerable to challenge." "Aren't you?" Grace's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Diane, I've had 15 years to prepare for this moment. Do you really think I would have moved forward without ensuring that my position was legally unassailable?" The conversation with Marcus, when it finally came, was conducted in his rented office downtown rather than at the family home. Grace had suggested the neutral location, understanding that her son needed to feel he was operating from his own territory. What she found when she arrived was a man who had spent a week building a fortress of rationalization around his wounded pride. Marcus's desk was covered with legal documents, financial projections, and what appeared to be a private investigator's report. He gestured for her to sit across from him with the kind of formal courtesy that barely concealed hostility. "Mother, I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me privately," he began, his tone carrying the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "I think we need to discuss the family's situation like adults." "I'm listening," Grace said, settling into the chair with the kind of patience that suggested she had nowhere else to be. "I've spent the past week reviewing the documentation you provided, and I have to say, there are some concerning irregularities. The timeline of certain property transfers, the complexity of the financial arrangements, the fact that you made these decisions during what must have been an emotionally vulnerable period following Dad's death." Grace watched her son with the kind of clinical attention she might give to a particularly interesting specimen. "What exactly are you suggesting, Marcus?" "I'm suggesting that someone took advantage of your grief to convince you to make financial decisions that weren't in your best interest. Or the family's best interest." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'm suggesting that we need to have these arrangements reviewed by independent counsel to ensure that you weren't manipulated or coerced." "I see." Grace's voice remained perfectly neutral. "And if this review determines that my decisions were made freely and competently?" Marcus's composure slipped slightly. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But Mother, you have to understand. The hotel liquidation I've been planning, the investment opportunities I've committed to, all of that was based on reasonable expectations about the family's assets." "Reasonable expectations," Grace repeated. "Based on what, exactly?" "Based on the assumption that Dad left the business to his family, not just to one person who might not fully understand the complexities of modern financial management." There it was. The core of Marcus's position laid bare. He genuinely believed that his mother was too old, too female, too emotionally compromised to manage significant assets. The fact that she had successfully managed and grown those assets for 15 years was irrelevant to him. What mattered was that her control disrupted his own financial plans. "Marcus," Grace said, her voice taking on a quality that her son had never heard before. Not anger, but something far more dangerous. "Let me make sure I understand your position. You believe that your 47-year-old mother was too grief-stricken and confused to make sound financial decisions. You believe that I've spent the past 15 years being manipulated by advisors who somehow convinced me to make profitable investments and strategic acquisitions. And you believe that the appropriate response is to challenge my legal ownership of property that belongs to me. I believe," Marcus said, his own voice hardening, "that family assets should be managed for the benefit of the entire family, not hoarded by someone who doesn't understand their full potential." "Their full potential," Grace mused. "You mean their potential to fund your investment schemes. I mean their potential to generate real returns rather than sitting in safe, conservative investments that barely keep pace with inflation." Grace opened her purse and withdrew a single sheet of paper, placing it on Marcus's desk with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for signing treaties. "These are the actual returns on the family portfolio over the past 15 years. You might find them illuminating." Marcus scanned the document, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching shock. The numbers showed consistent returns well above market averages, strategic timing of acquisitions and sales, and a level of financial sophistication that challenged everything he thought he knew about his mother's capabilities. "This can't be right," he said finally. "It's completely accurate. I can provide you with independently audited statements if you prefer." Grace retrieved the paper and returned it to her purse. "Marcus, you've spent the past week assuming that I've been hiding assets out of confusion or manipulation. It hasn't occurred to you that I might have been hiding them because I'm smarter than you gave me credit for." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the harmless figure he had been dismissing for 15 years. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want exactly what I said in the library meeting. Respect, consideration, to be treated as an intelligent adult rather than a sentimental relic." Grace stood, smoothing her skirt with careful precision. "What I don't want is a son who thinks he can intimidate me with legal threats," because his own financial planning was based on assumptions rather than facts. And if I proceed with the legal challenge anyway? Grace paused at the office door, her hand on the handle. Then you'll discover that the monthly support payments you've been receiving, the private school tuition, the apartment lease, the emergency funds that have appeared in your account whenever your expenses exceeded your income, all of those will cease immediately. You'll also discover that fighting someone with unlimited resources and 15 years of legal preparation is an expensive proposition. She opened the door, then turned back one final time. But more than that, Marcus, you'll discover what it actually means to act your age. At 52, you're old enough to support yourself without depending on someone you don't respect. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Marcus alone with the uncomfortable realization that he had just declared war on someone who had been supporting him for years, and who possessed both the resources and the strategic thinking to destroy him completely. The conversation with Jaime was different in every possible way. Grace found him in his studio as the sun was setting, working on a new painting with the kind of focused intensity that she remembered from his childhood, before addiction had stolen his clarity and confidence. "Don't stop on my account," she said, settling into her usual chair. "I like watching you work." Jaime continued painting for several more minutes, adding subtle details to what appeared to be a portrait of the estate's gardens in late autumn. When he finally set down his brush, his hands were steady and his expression was thoughtful rather than anxious. "Marcus stopped by yesterday," he said without preamble. "I imagine that was an interesting conversation. He wants me to support his legal challenge. Says you've been manipulated, that the family needs to protect you from predatory advisors." Jaime turned to face his mother directly. He also said that anyone who doesn't support him shouldn't expect family assistance in the future. Grace felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Not surprise, but disappointment. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him to go to hell." The bluntness of the response surprised a laugh out of Grace. "Jaime!" "I'm sorry, Mom, but I'm tired of him treating you like you're not capable of making your own decisions. I'm tired of him assuming that he knows what's best for everyone else. And I'm really tired of him threatening people to get his way." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the studio windows. Finally, Jaime spoke again. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. When you decided to support my recovery, the studio, the expenses, all of it, was it because you believed I could actually succeed, or was it because you felt sorry for me?" Grace considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Do you remember the painting you did during your second month of sobriety? The one of the harbor at dawn? The one you hung in your bedroom? I hung it there because it was the first time in 10 years that I saw your father's artistic vision in your work. Not technique, you'd always had that, but the ability to see something beautiful in the world and translate it into something that made other people see it too." She gestured toward the canvases that lined his studio walls. "I supported your recovery because I knew what you were capable of. Everything you've accomplished since then has simply confirmed that I was right." Jaime's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "Thank you." "For what?" "For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. For giving me the space to become the person I was supposed to be." He paused, then added quietly, "And for never making me feel like charity." As Grace walked back to the main house in the gathering darkness, she reflected on the conversations of the past week. Some relationships, she was learning, could survive the truth. Others apparently could not. But that was the risk she had always known she was taking. The question now was whether the family that emerged from this reckoning would be smaller but stronger, or whether Marcus's wounded pride would destroy what remained of the bonds she had spent a lifetime trying to protect. The answer, Grace suspected, would reveal itself soon enough. The October wind had a bite to it that morning, rattling the windows of the Brown estate and stripping the last defiant leaves from the oak trees that lined the circular drive. Grace stood in her late husband's study. Her study now, she reminded herself, watching through the tall windows as Marcus's black Mercedes pulled up to the front entrance. He had called the night before, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, demanding a family meeting to, quote, address the irregularities in the estate management once and for all. What Marcus didn't know was that Mrs. Hendricks had been listening on the kitchen extension, and that Grace had spent the evening preparing for what she suspected would be her eldest son's final attempt to reclaim control through manipulation and threats. The family gathered in the library once again, but the dynamics had shifted substantially since their first meeting 10 days earlier. Diane entered with Robert, their unified front unmistakable in the way they moved together, in the quiet confidence that comes from having made difficult decisions and found peace with them. Jaime arrived separately, carrying himself with the steady presence that sobriety had given him, no longer the uncertain figure who had sat silently through family conflicts. Tori was the last to arrive, and Grace noticed that her 17-year-old granddaughter had chosen her outfit with care: dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and the kind of serious expression that suggested she understood this meeting would determine her family's future. She took her seat between Jaime and her Aunt Diane, pointedly avoiding the chair next to her father. Marcus entered like a man preparing for battle, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of expensive suit that was meant to project authority. But Grace, watching him with 30 years of experience reading his moods, recognized the tells that suggested desperation beneath the confident facade: the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes couldn't quite meet hers, the aggressive set of his shoulders that meant he was preparing to attack because he felt cornered. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, settling at the head of the table with the presumption of someone who still believed himself to be the family leader. "I've called this meeting because we need to address some serious concerns about the family's financial management and Mom's situation." Grace remained silent, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had learned over the years that people often revealed more than they intended when allowed to speak without interruption. "I've spent the past week consulting with legal and financial experts," Marcus continued, opening his briefcase with theatrical precision. "What I've discovered is deeply troubling. The property transfers, the hidden accounts, the complex financial arrangements, all of it raises serious questions about undue influence and potential elder abuse." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Diane's sharp intake of breath was audible, and Jaime's face darkened with an anger that Grace rarely saw from her youngest son. Even Tori, who had been maintaining teenager-level composure, sat up straighter in her chair. "Elder abuse?" Diane's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Marcus, are you seriously suggesting that Mom has been abused?" "I'm suggesting that someone has taken advantage of her emotional vulnerability following Dad's death to manipulate her into making financial decisions that weren't in her best interest, or the family's best interest." Marcus pulled documents from his briefcase, spreading them across the table with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for evidence in criminal trials. These transfers happened during a period when Mom was grieving, possibly not thinking clearly, certainly not in a position to make complex financial decisions without proper guidance. Grace watched her son with the detached fascination of someone observing a particularly destructive natural phenomenon. He was so committed to his narrative of her incompetence that he couldn't see how thoroughly he was destroying himself with every word. "Proper guidance," she repeated quietly. "From whom exactly?" Marcus turned to her with an expression that managed to combine condescension with what he probably thought was concern. "From family, Mom. From people who love you and want to protect you. From people who understand the complexities of modern financial management. People like you. People like all of us," Marcus corrected, gesturing around the table. "This family has always made important decisions together. What you've done, hiding assets, making unilateral choices about properties that affect all of us, it's not just financially questionable, it's a betrayal of how this family operates." Robert Chen spoke for the first time, his architect's precision evident in every word. "Marcus, are you familiar with the legal definition of elder abuse?" Marcus's confidence flickered slightly. "I'm familiar enough." "Then you'll know that it requires evidence of exploitation, coercion, or fraud. What you've described, a competent adult making strategic financial decisions about her own property, doesn't meet any of those criteria." "Robert, with all due respect, you're not a lawyer." "No, but I am someone who has worked with Grace on these investments for years. I can testify to her competence, her strategic thinking, and her complete understanding of every decision she's made." Robert's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Can you say the same about your own financial decisions?" Because I'm quite certain that Grace can provide detailed documentation of every poor choice you've made over the past 5 years. The threat landed exactly as Robert had intended. Marcus's face flushed red, his carefully constructed narrative beginning to crumble under the weight of his own hypocrisy. "This isn't about my personal finances," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "Isn't it?" Jaime spoke quietly, but his words carried the kind of moral weight that comes from hard-won sobriety. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're attacking Mom because she won't fund your investment schemes." Marcus turned on his younger brother with visible fury. "Don't lecture me about responsibility, Jaime. You've been living off family charity for years." "You're right," Jaime said simply. "I have been. The difference is that I'm grateful for it, and I've used it to rebuild my life instead of demanding more." Tori chose that moment to speak, her teenage voice cutting through the adult complexity with devastating clarity. "Dad, you're embarrassing yourself." The room fell silent. Marcus stared at his daughter as if she had slapped him, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Grandma owns her own property," Tori continued, her tone carrying the kind of patient explanation usually reserved for very small children. "She made smart investments with her own money. She's been helping all of us without asking for anything in return. And your response is to call her crazy and threaten to sue her? Tori, you don't understand the complexities. I understand that you promised investors you could sell hotels that don't belong to you. I understand that you've been living beyond your means and expecting Grandma to cover the difference. And I understand that instead of saying thank you, you're trying to take what's hers because your investment scheme fell through." Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. "You have no idea what you're talking about. None of you understand what's at stake here. This family has resources, responsibilities, opportunities that are being wasted because of sentimental attachment to what?" Grace's voice cut through her son's tirade like a blade. "To treating family members with respect, to making strategic rather than speculative investments, to building wealth slowly and sustainably rather than gambling it on whatever shiny opportunity catches your attention." She stood, moving to the window that looked out over the estate grounds. "Marcus, you keep talking about this family's resources as if they're some kind of collective property that you have a right to manage. But they're not collective resources. They're my resources. Purchased with my money, managed according to my judgment, grown through my decisions." "Dad's money," Marcus corrected desperately. "Everything you have came from Dad's business." Grace turned back to face the room, her expression carrying the kind of cold authority that Mrs. Hendricks would have recognized as dangerous. "Did it? Are you certain about that?" She moved to the bookshelf, her fingers finding the hidden mechanism that opened the safe behind Thomas's books. But instead of the documents the family had seen before, she withdrew a different folder, one that was thicker, older, and carried the weight of decades. "Diane, you asked me last week why I kept the family's financial situation secret," Grace said, placing the folder on the table with careful precision. "I told you it was because I wanted to see who you really were. But that wasn't the complete truth." She opened the folder, revealing documents that predated Thomas's death by decades. Marriage certificates, business incorporation papers, property deeds. All of them bearing signatures and dates that told a very different story than the one the family had always believed. "The truth is that I built this empire alongside your father, not after his death. The hotels, the real estate acquisitions, the investment strategies, we developed all of it together as equal partners. When Thomas died, he didn't leave me a business to manage. He left me a business we had built together, with full confidence that I could continue growing it alone." Marcus stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "That's impossible. Dad was the businessman. You were just what, Marcus?" Grace's voice carried 15 years of accumulated frustration. "Just the wife? Just the pretty hostess who smiled at business dinners and stayed quiet while the men talked about important things?" She pulled out a photograph, Thomas and Grace at a construction site, both wearing hard hats and examining architectural plans. "This is the groundbreaking for the Seaside Boutique Hotel. I chose the location, negotiated the purchase, and designed the financing structure. Your father handled construction oversight." Another photograph, Grace shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit while Thomas looked on proudly. This is the closing on the Hartford commercial complex. I identified the opportunity, analyzed the market potential, and structured the deal. Document after document revealed the same pattern. Grace as an active strategic partner in every major business decision, not the passive beneficiary Marcus had always assumed her to be. Your father trusted me completely with financial decisions because he knew I was better at them than he was, Grace said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a secret finally revealed. The only thing that changed after his death was that I no longer had to pretend to defer to male authority when dealing with lawyers and accountants who couldn't imagine that a woman might understand money. The room was absolutely silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of Marcus's worldview collapsing around him. So when you talk about protecting me from manipulation, Grace continued, what you're really saying is that you can't accept that your mother has always been smarter than you gave her credit for. When you talk about elder abuse, what you're really describing is your own inability to accept that I don't need your protection or your management. She moved back to her chair, settling with the kind of calm finality that suggested the conversation was nearly over. And when you threaten legal action to challenge my competence, what you're really doing is announcing to the world that you're willing to destroy your own mother's reputation to get access to money that was never yours in the first place. Marcus sat in his expensive suit, surrounded by the wreckage of his assumptions, staring at documentation that proved his mother had always been the strategic mind behind the family's success. Everything he had built his identity around, his role as the family's financial leader, his assumption that he would inherit control of the business empire, his belief that his mother needed his protection and guidance, all of it was revealed as fantasy. I was trying to protect the family, he said weakly. No, Tori said quietly. You were trying to protect yourself. There's a difference. The meeting ended not with argument or negotiation, but with Marcus gathering his papers in silence and walking out of the library like a man in shock. Grace watched him go, feeling not triumph but a deep sadness for the relationship that might have been possible if her son had ever learned to see her as a person rather than a role. Is he going to be okay? Diane asked quietly. Grace considered the question carefully. That depends entirely on whether he can learn to build his identity around something other than what he thinks he's entitled to inherit. As the family dispersed, Grace remained in the library, surrounded by the evidence of 3 decades of strategic planning and careful growth. She had wanted to teach her family respect, but she was beginning to understand that some lessons could only be learned through loss. The question now was whether Marcus would learn from this defeat, or whether his wounded pride would drive him to even more destructive choices. Grace suspected she wouldn't have to wait long to find out. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus's failed attempt to rally family support against Grace's authority, and the Brown estate had settled into an uneasy quiet that felt more like the calm before a storm than any kind of resolution. Grace had used the time to prepare for what she knew would be the final confrontation, not just with Marcus, but with the fundamental question of whether this family could survive the truth about itself. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Grace was reviewing quarterly reports in Thomas's study. Mrs. Hendricks knocked softly on the doorframe, her expression carrying the kind of controlled concern that meant serious news. Jonathan Brewster is on the phone, she said quietly. He says it's urgent. Grace picked up the extension, already suspecting what she would hear. Good morning, Jonathan. Grace, I'm afraid I have some troubling news. Marcus has filed a petition for guardianship, claiming you're suffering from age-related cognitive decline and are unable to manage your financial affairs competently. The words should have been shocking, but Grace felt only a cold satisfaction that her son had finally revealed the full extent of his desperation. What exactly is he alleging? The petition claims that your recent erratic financial behavior, specifically the revelation of hidden assets and what he's calling, quote, irrational secrecy, demonstrates diminished mental capacity. He's requesting that the court appoint him as your guardian with full authority over your financial affairs. Grace was quiet for a moment, processing not just the legal implications but the emotional weight of what her son was attempting. I assume you have thoughts about the viability of his petition. I have 15 years of documentation proving your complete mental competency, including recent psychological evaluations, detailed financial records showing sophisticated investment strategies, and testimony from multiple professionals who can attest to your cognitive abilities. Jonathan's voice carried the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this possibility for years. More importantly, I have evidence that Marcus has been financially dependent on you for years, while publicly claiming to be the family's financial leader. His credibility as a petitioner is questionable. Nevertheless, he's forced us into a public legal battle. Yes. And Grace, I need you to understand. Even though we'll win, this process will be invasive and unpleasant. Marcus is essentially arguing that you're mentally incompetent. That means court-ordered psychological evaluations, financial audits, testimony from family members about your behavior and decision-making. Grace absorbed this information with the kind of calm that comes from having anticipated the worst-case scenario. How long will it take? 6 to 8 months, probably. But Grace, there's something else. Marcus isn't doing this alone. He's hired Thornfield and Associates. They specialize in high-stakes family disputes and elder law. This is going to be expensive and aggressive. After hanging up, Grace sat in the leather chair that still smelled faintly of Thomas's pipe tobacco, contemplating the magnitude of what her son was attempting. He wasn't just challenging her legal authority, he was trying to have her declared mentally incompetent, to strip away not just her financial control but her basic autonomy as an adult. It was, she realized, the logical conclusion of 30 years of dismissing her intelligence and treating her opinions as irrelevant. That evening, Grace called her own family meeting. Not in the formal library this time, but in the kitchen, the heart of the house where the most important conversations had always happened. She found Mrs. Hendricks preparing dinner, her movements carrying the efficient precision of someone who had spent 30 years anticipating the family's needs. "Eleanor, I need you to hear this too," Grace said, settling at the kitchen table where she had solved countless family problems over the decades. "You've been part of this family longer than anyone." When the others arrived, Grace noticed the subtle ways their relationships had shifted over the past month. Diane and Robert entered together, their unity unmistakable in the way they moved as a team rather than individuals. Jaime came from his studio, paint still under his fingernails, but his presence was steady and grounded in a way that spoke to real recovery rather than just sobriety. Tori arrived last, carrying herself with the kind of serious attention that meant she understood this conversation would be different from the others. "Marcus has filed a legal petition to have me declared mentally incompetent," Grace said without preamble. "He's asking the court to appoint him as my guardian, with full authority over my financial affairs." The silence that followed was profound. Diane's face went white, Jaime's hands clenched into fists, and Tori's expression shifted from surprise to a kind of cold fury that reminded Grace powerfully of her late husband. "He can't do that," Diane said finally. "Can he?" "Anyone can file a petition," Grace replied calmly. "Whether it succeeds is another matter entirely, but the process will be public, invasive, and designed to challenge every decision I've made over the past 15 years." Robert leaned forward, his architect's mind already working through the structural implications. What kind of evidence would he need to present? "He'll argue that my secrecy about the family's assets demonstrates irrational behavior. He'll claim that my investment strategies are too conservative for someone of sound mind. He'll probably bring in experts to testify that my hoarding of family resources shows cognitive decline." Mrs. Hendricks made a sound that was somewhere between a snort and a laugh. 30 years I've watched that boy, and he's never once made a decision that wasn't driven by what he wanted rather than what was smart. "Nevertheless," Grace continued, "he's forcing us into a legal battle that will require all of you to take sides publicly. The court will want testimony from family members about my mental state, my decision-making abilities, my interactions with all of you." Tori spoke first, her 17-year-old voice carrying absolute certainty. "Then they'll hear that you're the smartest person in this family and the only one who's been making sense for years." "Tori, you need to understand what this means," Grace said gently. "If you testify on my behalf, your father will see it as a betrayal. Your relationship with him, whatever's left of it, will probably be destroyed permanently." Tori's response was immediate and unwavering. "Good. Maybe then I won't have to pretend to respect someone who's trying to steal from his own mother." Jaime was nodding slowly. his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Always. If Marcus succeeds, if he somehow convinces a court that you're not competent, what happens to the rest of us?" It was a practical question that cut to the heart of everyone's concerns, and Grace appreciated her youngest son's willingness to voice it directly. "If Marcus gains control of my assets, he'll liquidate everything he can to fund his investment schemes. The hotels will be sold, probably at below market prices to expedite the transactions. This house will either be sold or mortgaged to provide additional capital. The various support systems I've put in place, Diane's gallery assistance, your studio rent, the educational funds I've established, all of that will disappear immediately." She paused, letting the implications settle. "But more than that, Marcus will have legal authority to make decisions about my living situation, my medical care, my daily life. Guardianship isn't just about money, it's about fundamental autonomy." Diane was crying now, though whether from anger or sadness wasn't clear. "How can he do this? How can he try to take away your independence?" "Because he's never seen me as a complete person," Grace replied. "To Marcus, I've always been either an asset to be managed or an obstacle to be overcome. The idea that I might be a strategic thinker capable of making my own decisions has never occurred to him." Mrs. Hendricks set down her dish towel with the kind of deliberate precision that meant she was about to say something important. "Grace, I've been thinking about this since Jonathan's call, and I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I've been keeping records. 30 years of watching this family, listening to conversations, observing behavior. I know things about Marcus's financial history, his treatment of you, his private comments about your supposed incompetence." Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years. "If he wants to make this a public battle about your mental state, I can provide testimony about his." Grace felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen's temperature. "Eleanor, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. I've watched you build an empire while letting everyone assume you were just managing household accounts. I've seen you support ungrateful children while they dismissed your intelligence. I've listened to Marcus make cruel jokes about your age and your gender when he thought you couldn't hear." Mrs. Hendricks's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "If he wants to question your competence in court, he's going to discover that I have 30 years of evidence about his character and judgment." The conversation continued for another hour, covering legal strategies, potential testimony, and the practical implications of a prolonged court battle. But what struck Grace most powerfully was the unified front her family was presenting, not the family as Marcus had tried to define it, centered around his authority and expectations, but the family as it actually existed. People who had chosen to support each other through difficulty and growth. "There's one more thing," Grace said as the meeting was winding down. "I want all of you to understand exactly what we're fighting for. This isn't just about my right to control my own assets. It's about whether families can be built on respect and genuine affection, or whether they're just economic units where power belongs to whoever can claim it most aggressively." Tori looked up from the notes she had been taking. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you win this court case, when you win it, what happens to Dad?" It was the question Grace had been dreading, because it forced her to confront the possibility that she might have to choose between protecting herself and preserving what remained of her relationship with her eldest son. "That depends on him," she said finally. "If he's willing to accept that his assumptions about me were wrong, if he can learn to treat me with the respect he'd show any other competent adult, then we can rebuild our relationship on honest foundations. And if he can't?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the little boy who had once brought her wildflowers from the garden, who had sat in this same kitchen asking for help with homework and comfort after nightmares. Somewhere inside the angry, entitled man trying to have her declared incompetent was that child, but she was no longer certain he could be reached. "Then he'll discover that actions have consequences," she said quietly, "and that some choices can't be undone." As the family dispersed that evening, Grace remained in the kitchen with Mrs. Hendricks, watching her oldest friend clean up after what might have been their last peaceful family gathering for months to come. "Are you worried?" Mrs. Hendricks asked. Grace considered the question carefully. "I'm sad," she said finally. "I'm angry. I'm disappointed that it's come to this. But worried? No. I've been preparing for this possibility for 15 years." Marcus is about to discover that underestimating someone for 3 decades is a very expensive mistake. The legal papers were served the next morning, delivered by a process server who apologized for the intrusion while handing Grace documents that formally challenged her right to control her own life. She read them carefully, noting the specific language Marcus's lawyers had chosen, the particular narrative they were constructing about her supposed incompetence. What they didn't know, what Marcus had never bothered to learn, was that Grace Brown had been preparing for this battle since the day Thomas died. Every document was in order, every decision was documented, every strategy had been reviewed by experts who could testify to her complete mental competency. Marcus wanted a war about whether his mother was too old, too female, too emotionally compromised to manage significant assets. Grace was going to give him exactly what he asked for. And she was going to win. The courthouse in downtown Millbrook had never hosted a family drama quite like the one unfolding in Judge Patricia Whitman's courtroom on a gray December morning. Grace Brown sat at the defendant's table, though she refused to think of herself as a defendant, wearing a navy suit that projected competence without ostentation, her silver hair styled with the kind of careful attention that suggested she understood the importance of appearances in legal proceedings. Across the aisle, Marcus occupied the petitioner's table with his high-priced legal team from Thornfield and Associates. He had lost weight over the past 2 months, his expensive suits hanging slightly loose on a frame that spoke to sleepless nights, and the kind of stress that comes from having committed to a course of action that grows more questionable with each passing day. The preliminary hearings had not gone well for Marcus. Judge Whitman, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years of experience in family law, had quickly grown impatient with arguments that seemed to rest more on wounded pride than actual evidence of incompetence. The court-ordered psychological evaluation had pronounced Grace exceptionally competent, with cognitive abilities well above average for her age group. The financial audit had revealed not reckless spending or confused decision-making, but a sophisticated investment strategy that had consistently outperformed market averages. Now, as the final hearing began, Marcus was facing the uncomfortable reality that his case was collapsing around him. "Your Honor," began Marcus's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Thornfield, who specialized in what she euphemistically called family wealth preservation disputes. "We contend that Mrs. Brown's secretive financial behavior, her hoarding of family assets, and her sudden revelation of these holdings demonstrate a pattern of irrational decision-making consistent with age-related cognitive decline." Judge Whitman raised an eyebrow. "Counselor, are you arguing that strategic financial planning constitutes evidence of mental incompetence?" "We're arguing that the defendant's deliberate concealment of family assets from her own children, combined with her refusal to consider reasonable investment opportunities, suggests impaired judgment." Grace's attorney, Jonathan Brewster, stood with the kind of calm confidence that comes from holding a winning hand. "Your Honor, if I may address the court's concerns about Mrs. Brown's supposed concealment of assets." "Proceed, Mr. Brewster. Mrs. Brown's financial records show 15 years of careful documentation, regular consultation with certified financial advisors, and strategic decision-making that has grown the family's wealth by approximately 300% since her husband's death. Every transaction has been legal, properly documented, and in complete accordance with her authority as the sole owner of these assets." Jonathan gestured toward the evidence table, which was covered with binders containing 15 years of financial records. What the petitioner characterizes as hoarding and secrecy, the evidence shows to be prudent wealth management and the reasonable desire to maintain privacy about her financial affairs. Furthermore, Jonathan continued, his voice gaining strength, Mrs. Brown has been providing substantial financial support to her adult children for years, including the petitioner himself. Mr. Marcus Brown has received approximately $400,000 in direct and indirect support from his mother over the past 5 years, support that enabled him to maintain a lifestyle well beyond his actual income. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Jonathan laid out the details of his financial dependence. private school tuition paid directly to institutions, apartment lease payments processed through Grace's accountant, emergency funds that appeared in his accounts whenever his expenses exceeded his income. All of it documented with the kind of precision that made denial impossible. The petitioner now seeks guardianship over the woman who has been supporting him, Jonathan concluded, not because she lacks competence, but because she has declined to fund his speculative investment schemes. Judge Whitman turned her attention to Marcus. Mr. Brown, you're requesting guardianship over your mother based on her refusal to liquidate profitable assets to fund what you've described as, quote, technology investments. Can you explain to the court why this constitutes evidence of incompetence rather than reasonable financial conservatism? Marcus stood, his lawyer having coached him for this moment, but his confidence was clearly shaken. Your Honor, my mother has always been conservative in her financial approach, but the opportunities I've identified represent significant potential returns that could benefit the entire family. What kind of returns are we discussing? 15 to 20% annually, potentially higher if the technology performs as projected. And the risks? Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with this line of questioning. All investments carry some degree of risk, Your Honor. Mr. Brown, according to the financial analysis provided by your mother's advisors, the investments you're proposing have a failure rate of approximately 60%, with total loss of principal being the most common outcome. Would you characterize your mother's reluctance to risk family assets on such investments as irrational? The question hung in the air like a challenge Marcus couldn't meet. His entire case rested on the assumption that his mother's conservatism constituted incompetence. But under judicial scrutiny, his own judgment appeared far more questionable than hers. Judge Whitman called a brief recess, during which Grace's family gathered in the courthouse hallway with the kind of quiet solidarity that had emerged over the past months. Diane held her mother's arm, not because Grace needed physical support, but because the gesture provided emotional comfort to both women. Jaime stood nearby, his recovery-trained instincts alert to the stress levels around him, while Tori paced with teenage energy that needed an outlet. How do you think it's going? Diane asked quietly. Jonathan Brewster joined the group, his expression cautiously optimistic. Judge Whitman is asking exactly the right questions. Marcus's case was weak from the beginning, and it's getting weaker with every answer he provides. What happens if we win? Tori asked. When we win, Grace corrected gently, the guardianship petition is dismissed, and I retain full control over my financial affairs. Marcus will be responsible for his own legal fees, and the court record will permanently reflect that his allegations were found to be without merit. And what happens to Dad? It was the question that had been hovering over the family for months. Grace's victory would come at the cost of publicly humiliating her eldest son, destroying his credibility in both legal and financial circles. He would face not just defeat, but professional embarrassment that could follow him for years. That depends on him, Grace said quietly. This case has forced all of us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our family dynamics. How we move forward from here will depend on whether people are willing to learn from those truths. When court reconvened, Judge Whitman called Grace to testify on her own behalf. She took the witness stand with the kind of calm dignity that Mrs. Hendricks would have recognized as dangerous. The expression Grace wore when she was prepared to reveal exactly how much she knew and had been keeping to herself. Mrs. Brown, Jonathan began, can you explain to the court your decision to maintain privacy about your financial affairs? Grace turned slightly toward the judge, speaking directly rather than through her attorney. Your Honor, I chose to keep the extent of my assets private because I wanted to understand my family's true character. When people believe you have no power, they show you who they really are. And what did you learn? I learned that most of my family members are good people who are capable of growth and genuine affection. I also learned that one of them was more interested in what he thought he could inherit than in building authentic relationships. Patricia Thornfield objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant, but Judge Whitman overruled her. The witness may continue. Your Honor, I spent 15 years building financial security for my family while allowing them to believe I was just a harmless widow managing household accounts. During that time, I supported all of them in various ways, sometimes with their knowledge, sometimes without. What I discovered was that respect and appreciation aren't automatic. even within families. They have to be earned. Grace's voice remained steady as she continued. My son Marcus has spent years dismissing my opinions, treating my concerns as irrelevant, and assuming that my age and gender made me incapable of understanding serious financial matters. When I revealed that I actually controlled the assets he wanted to liquidate, his response wasn't gratitude for years of support or curiosity about my investment strategies. His response was to have me declared mentally incompetent. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. Even Marcus seemed frozen in place, finally hearing his mother articulate the full scope of his dismissive treatment. Mrs. Brown, Patricia Thornfield began her cross-examination. Isn't it true that you deliberately deceived your family about your financial situation? I maintained privacy about my personal finances, yes. And isn't it true that this deception caused your family members to make financial decisions based on incorrect assumptions? Grace considered the question carefully. My family members made assumptions about my capabilities and my resources without ever asking me directly. I didn't encourage those assumptions, but I also didn't correct them until it became necessary. Necessary for what? Necessary to protect my assets from being liquidated to fund speculative investments that I considered unwise. Thornfield pressed harder. Mrs. Brown, don't you think your family deserved to know the truth about their financial situation? My family deserved to be treated with honesty and respect, Grace replied. But the truth about financial situations works both ways. My son has been living beyond his means for years while claiming to be a financial expert. He's been accepting support from me while publicly positioning himself as the family's business leader. If we're talking about honesty and transparency, perhaps we should examine everyone's behavior, not just mine. The cross-examination continued for another hour, but Thornfield was unable to shake Grace's composure or create any doubt about her mental competency. If anything, her testimony reinforced the impression of someone who had been thinking strategically for years, while others operated on assumptions and entitlement. Mrs. Hendricks testified next, providing 30 years of observations about the family dynamics. Her testimony was devastating in its precision, painting a picture of Marcus as someone who had consistently underestimated his mother while overestimating his own capabilities. I've watched Mrs. Brown manage complex financial decisions for 3 decades, she told the court. During her husband's lifetime, she was an equal partner in every major business decision. After his death, she continued to demonstrate the same strategic thinking and careful judgment. If anything, her financial performance improved without having to defer to male authority figures who didn't always appreciate her insights. The final witness was Robert Chen, whose testimony as both family member and financial advisor provided crucial credibility to Grace's position. He described years of consultation on property acquisitions, investment strategies, and family support decisions, all of which demonstrated sophisticated understanding of financial markets and legal implications. Mrs. Brown's approach to wealth management has been consistently conservative but effective, he testified. She prioritizes long-term growth over short-term gains, diversified holdings over concentrated risks, and family stability over speculative opportunities. These are the hallmarks of competent financial planning, not cognitive decline. As the hearing concluded, Judge Whitman announced that she would issue her ruling within 48 hours. Grace and her family left the courthouse in the fading December light, walking through the first snow of the season toward cars that would take them back to an estate that might finally be at peace. Marcus remained behind with his legal team, his face carrying the expression of someone who had just watched his worldview collapse in public. The son, who had spent 30 years assuming he would inherit leadership of the family business, had instead been forced to confront the reality that he had never understood either the business or the family at all. The Brown family was about to learn whether their bonds were strong enough to survive the truth about themselves. Grace suspected the answer would define them for generations to come. 6 months later, spring had returned to the Brown estate with the kind of gentle persistence that makes New England winters worth enduring. Grace stood in her garden, examining the first shoots of the tulips she had planted the previous fall. An act of faith in the future that had seemed particularly important during the darkest days of the legal battle. The tulips had emerged exactly where she had planted them, which struck her as satisfying in a world where so many other things had shifted beyond recognition. Judge Whitman's ruling had been unequivocal and swift. The guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Marcus could never file such a claim again. The court had found no evidence of mental incompetence, instead praising Grace's, quote, exemplary financial stewardship and strategic thinking. Marcus was ordered to pay all court costs, and the public record would forever reflect that his allegations had been found to be completely without merit. But the legal victory had come at a cost that Grace was still calculating. Marcus had not spoken to her since the ruling. He had moved out of the estate within a week of the court's decision, taking only his personal belongings and leaving behind the life he had built on assumptions about his inheritance. His financial situation, stripped of Grace's support and burdened with substantial legal fees, had deteriorated rapidly. The Manhattan apartment was gone, the private school tuition was now his responsibility, and the investment opportunities he had been so eager to pursue had evaporated along with his credibility. Tori had chosen to stay at the estate, a decision that had formalized the rift between father and daughter. At 18 now, she was legally an adult, and had made it clear that she considered her grandmother to be the family member most worthy of respect and emulation. She was spending the summer working with Grace, learning the intricacies of the family business, with a kind of eager intelligence that reminded Grace powerfully of her younger self. Grandma. Tori called from the estate's back terrace, where she had set up a temporary office to review quarterly reports. The Harbor Point property numbers are in, and you're going to want to see this. Grace made her way up from the garden, noting with satisfaction that her granddaughter had arranged the financial documents with the same methodical precision that had served Grace well for decades. The Harbor Point acquisition had been risky, a waterfront property that required significant renovation, but Grace's instincts about the location had proven correct. 23% return on investment, Tori announced, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. The renovation costs came in under budget, and we've got a waiting list for next summer's bookings. And what does that teach us about risk assessment? Grace asked, settling into the chair across from her granddaughter. That calculated risks based on solid research are different from speculation based on wishful thinking, Tori replied promptly. Dad's tech investments were gambling. This was strategic planning. The comparison to Marcus was inevitable but still painful. Grace had hoped that defeat might humble her son enough to open a conversation about rebuilding their relationship. But 6 months of silence suggested that his pride was stronger than his capacity for growth. Have you heard from him? Grace asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Tori's expression darkened. He called last week asking for money. Not asking to apologize or wanting to have a conversation about the family. Just asking for a loan to cover his rent, because his investment banking job isn't working out. Grace wasn't surprised. Marcus's attempt to have her declared incompetent had become public knowledge in financial circles, destroying his reputation among the professional contacts who might have offered him opportunities. Clients were unlikely to trust their money to someone who had publicly questioned his own mother's mental competency and lost in court. What did you tell him? I told him to call you directly if he wanted to have an adult conversation about his situation. But that if he just wanted money without accountability, he was talking to the wrong person. Grace felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness at her granddaughter's response. Tori had developed the kind of clear-eyed judgment that Grace had spent decades learning, but at 18 she was already better at maintaining boundaries than Grace had been at 40. The sound of car tires on gravel announced visitors, and Grace looked up to see Diane's car pulling into the circular drive. These days, Sunday dinners had become smaller but more genuine affairs. Diane and Robert, Jaime, Tori, and Mrs. Hendricks gathering around the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room where so much family drama had unfolded. Jaime emerged from his studio to greet his sister, and Grace watched the easy affection between her two youngest children with satisfaction. The legal battle had forced everyone to choose sides, but it had also revealed who was capable of growth and who was trapped by their own assumptions about power and entitlement. "How's the gallery?" Grace asked as Diane joined them on the terrace. "Thriving," Diane replied, her voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been there a year ago. "The Morrison retrospective sold out, and we've got 3 new artists whose work is generating serious collector interest." and the finances. Completely transparent now, Diane said with a smile. Robert and I have a monthly review of all the gallery's expenses and revenues, including the family support. No more mysterious deposits or hidden assistance. I know exactly what I'm earning and what I'm receiving, and I can plan accordingly. It was, Grace reflected, exactly the kind of honest partnership she had hoped for but hadn't known how to request. The legal battle had forced conversations that might never have happened otherwise, revealing needs and capabilities that had been hidden beneath years of polite family dysfunction. Mrs. Hendricks appeared in the doorway, announcing that dinner was ready with the kind of understated authority that came from 3 decades of managing the family's daily rhythms. These days, her role had evolved beyond housekeeper to something closer to chief of staff, helping Grace coordinate the increasingly complex business operations while maintaining the domestic stability that kept the family grounded. As they gathered around the kitchen table, Grace looked at the faces surrounding her, smaller in number than a year ago, but more authentic in their connections. Diane and Robert's partnership had strengthened under pressure. Jaime's recovery had solidified into genuine confidence, and Tori was developing into the kind of strategic thinker who could carry the family legacy forward. The empty chair where Marcus might have sat was noticeable but not devastating. Grace had learned that family wasn't just about blood relations or shared history. It was about people who chose to support each other through difficulty and growth. "I have an announcement," Grace said as Mrs. Hendricks served the roast that had become their traditional Sunday meal. "I've been working with Jonathan on some estate planning updates, and I wanted to share the decisions I've made about succession." The table fell quiet, everyone understanding that this conversation would shape the family's future for decades to come. "Tori," Grace continued, turning to her granddaughter, "you'll be inheriting controlling interest in the business operations, along with this property. Not immediately, of course, but with a clear path toward full responsibility as you complete your education and gain experience." Tori's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Thank you, Grandma, I won't let you down." Diane, the art-related properties, and a substantial endowment for the gallery. Jaime, the creative properties and funds to establish a proper foundation for emerging artists. Grace paused, knowing that her next words would define not just financial arrangements but the family's values going forward. "And Marcus? Marcus will receive exactly what he's entitled to as my son, a fair share of the estate's value but no control over business operations or family assets. If he chooses to rebuild our relationship based on mutual respect, those arrangements could change. But respect cannot be inherited. It has to be earned." As dinner concluded and the family began their familiar routines of cleaning up and settling in for the evening, Grace felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning legal battles or proving her competence. She had successfully transformed a family built on assumptions and entitlement into one built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The cost had been significant: a relationship with Marcus that might never recover, public scrutiny that had been painful for everyone, and the loss of the comfortable fiction that families naturally operate on love rather than power dynamics. But what remained was stronger than what had been lost. Grace had reclaimed not just her authority but her voice, and in doing so, she had taught her family that respect was something that had to be given to be received. At 74, she was finally old enough to be exactly who she had always been. Grace Brown sat in her study at 75, watching dawn illuminate the Connecticut coast. 1 year after her legal victory, the family had transformed completely. Tori, now 19, was learning the business with strategic brilliance. Jaime's art flourished in his 4th year of sobriety. Diane's gallery had become a cultural institution. Marcus remained absent, his pride preventing reconciliation after the failed guardianship attempt. Grace reviewed her updated will. Tori inheriting business control, Diane receiving cultural properties, Jaime gaining creative security. Marcus would receive fair financial inheritance, but no operational authority. She had built a family based on respect rather than entitlement, smaller but authentic, stronger than before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.